Hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Monocle. Today, we're going to be discussing the Star Wars prequel trilogy and if it's underrated. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Monocle. My name is Grant Skillen, and if you've watched the show, you know that I'm not the normal host. Grant Ingram is currently in a cross-country trip and might be able to join in later. We'll see, but today I get to be the host. And to make it even more special, I have a special guest joining me, Mr. Taylor Murphy. How are you doing, Taylor?
I'm doing good. How are you guys doing? Well, how are you doing? Normally when I'm a guest, I have more people, but Grant is driving from the East Coast to the West Coast, so he has a valid excuse.
Yes, he is currently on a road trip across the country, so he might be joining in a little bit. He might not be, but I've got Taylor here, and I think this will be a good episode. So today, as the title, as I mentioned earlier, and if you've been watching, you'll know that we're in the middle of our Star Wars month. So last week, we did the original trilogy as our just classic, and then this week, we have our hidden gem, which is the prequel trilogy. And so, as that title kind of suggests, and as I mentioned earlier, our title is the prequel trilogy underrated. That's what we're going to be discussing today. So, for a little bit of context about the prequel trilogy, of course, everyone has seen the original trilogy. Came out, I believe, it was in the 70s.
Yep,
and
77 through 82 or 83, I believe.
Yeah,
they were the ones that I grew up with.
Yeah. And so then when episode 5 came out and George Lucas numbered them 4 and 5, people were like, hey, where's 1, 2, and 3? And so even then, George Lucas was setting up this backstory 20 years ahead of when these movies came out. And so once you get through episode 6, everyone then is excited and just ready for, oh, what's the backstory? How did we get here? So then in 20 so years later, in 1999, when The Phantom Menace came out, we got to see the beginning of that. And I think Taylor could agree. He was around for it. I know I wasn't. I wasn't born yet, but the reaction when it came out was not the best.
It was very unique. I was a kid at the time. I think I was middle school going into high school I was in middle school when episode 1 came out. And I was in high school when episode 2 and 3 came out. And I remember that leading up to episode 1, they re-released the special editions in theaters as a anniversary thing, and they added the new scenes, and all the hype was there. And a bunch of new toys came out, and then episode 1 started, and the internet in its early infancy was very much in awe of these things. And everyone loved the idea of Darth Maul. They loved the look of him. And then people were not my age. I loved it, but people who were diehard Star Wars fans of the originals, they couldn't see the big picture, and they were upset that it wasn't what their headcanons had made in the road leading up to it. So a lot of it was like people just thinking they had it all figured out and then being like, what the hell, when it came out.
And I mean, you've got 20 years. Yeah. And you've got 20 years, so there's all this time of, these movies are coming, and so everyone's going, oh, what led up to this? What's the story of Anakin? What's the story of the Jedi Order? How did it fall? How do we get here? And it's not what most people expected. It's really only what George Lucas expected.
Yeah.
And that kind of shows, if you look at the Rotten Tomato scores for the movie, Phantom Menace has a 51% tomato meter and a 59% audience score. Attack of the Clones has a 65% tomato meter and a 56% audience score. So Attack of the Clones has a lower audience score than the Phantom Menace. And then Revenge of the Sith's a little better. It's got a 79% tomato meter and a 66% audience score.
Which is kind of silly because these movies came out before Rotten Tomatoes, so all of these grades are in retrospect. And at the same time, if you look at the sequel trilogy, which I'm sure you guys are probably going to be doing next week as part of your Star Wars month, the sequel trilogy has the highest Rotten Tomato scores, and if you talk to any Star Wars fan, they will unanimously disagree with that. So Rotten Tomatoes is a funny thing.
Yeah, it's a very funny thing. We've got CY98 in here talking about Lucas had the backstory mapped out while he was making episode 4, and then he gives a little description here of how George Lucas described it in 1975. So Lucas even set a general picture of the Jedi are going to fall and Emperor is going to take over and turn it from Republic into an empire.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what ends up happening.
100%.
Yeah.
It was funny because even when I was a kid, I think maybe I was like 11 or 12. I don't remember the exact age I was when that movie came out, but I remember seeing it in theaters. And then when Senator Palpatine was dressed by name, they're like, Senator Palpatine. I'm like, oh my God, it's the Emperor. And there were so many people who didn't know that, because at the time, the Emperor is never actually name dropped once in the original sequel, in the original trilogy. They call him Emperor, they call him the Emperor, but Palpatine was only given on the merchandise, like the action figures and stuff like that. So unless you knew the backstory or had the toys, the connection wasn't there for a lot of people. So as soon as they saw this guy come out saying, "Oh, he's making these comments about how good he is," you're like, "No, he's the bad guy."
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the genius of it, because then if you're someone who's never watched Star Wars, you can watch 4, 5, and 6 and then go back. But at this point, you would know kind of,
Yeah,
in a sense, that was going to be the Emperor. But you could watch it 1, 2, 3 now, and if you know nothing, that would be a twist. You might be able to sense some things are a little off, but that would still be a twist coming, that the guy who's in charge of the Senate turned out to be the bad guy.
What I think the biggest jarring thing for a lot of people when they first saw the movie was the revelation that Anakin Skywalker was the chosen one. As soon as they started talking about the chosen one and the Immaculate Conception, all those things, people were like, Darth Vader's not guy. But then it started this controversy where people were like, no, he can't be the chosen one. His son is the chosen one. But then once all 3 came out and then you looked at all 6 together, you're like, oh my God, he was the chosen one. So
yeah,
there was a lot of people who, thanks to the expanded universe of everything Star Wars that existed after Return of the Jedi and George Lucas not decanonizing anything or anything like that, people had their own ideas of what they thought the prequel should be. They thought, oh, Thrawn should be introduced. Oh, this character should be introduced. These things should be introduced. But those were all, none of those things were George Lucas's creation, so he never went with them. And I think, especially as it went into episode 2, when they retconned, well, not even retconned, when he defined who Boba Fett was, it retconned everything that everyone knew about him in Legends. And the expanded universe had his real name being Jaster Muriel, and he was not at all what he was. And then they turned it into the Clone Wars was actually clone soldiers, and the implications were so much bigger, and it definitely turned the entire audience on its head. So it was a very interesting time.
Yeah. And you mentioned Darth Maul, and Darth Maul has kind of always been one of my favorite characters. I'm kind of weird. I've always liked the bad guys in movies. So like Vader is one of my favorite characters. Maul was one of my favorite characters. And I think it was Dave Filoni. If everyone kind of knows now who Dave Filoni is, he also did a lot of work with George Lucas on the prequel trilogy, which I'm not sure everyone knows about. But there's videos on YouTube, and we got a comment here, which is a very good comment. Lucas was thinking of the overall story, even if it meant alienating audience who grew up with the originals.
Yes.
I don't know if it's necessarily alienating them, but just like, here, I've got the story. This is what it is, even if the others had their own opinion.
Well, I
like your profile picture, by the way.
Yeah. I talked about this in detail in the podcast episode we did earlier last year, I think, where we had it was called the Storytime episode, where we went through George Lucas's planned original trilogy for the sequels. And we talked about how with the changes to the headcanon that fans had with the prequels, it was going to really pay off in his sequel trilogy by defining what the midichlorians were, defining what the Force was, and then saying that there was not only the Force, but there was a companion to it as well. And then they never did anything with it. So he actually had this giant 9-movie story arc that he had established, and he literally made the center trilogy out of financial convenience. Is really what it was, because he realized that he couldn't tell Anakin's story the way it needed to be told with the technology at hand. So he started in the middle and then worked his way around the technology of the time and defined the technology of the time by creating a lot of it.
Yeah. And the original trilogy, a lot of the stuff holds up. We talked about some last week. Some of the speeder scenes are a little sketchy, but overall, it's still really solid to go back and watch.
No, it's 100% solid. It's one of the... Yeah. I argue with some people that the original Star Wars trilogy probably can compete with Lord of the Rings as the best trilogy ever made. And to this day, I mean, you can still watch these movies and you can be like, oh wow, it's 40 years old, but the special effects are still pretty good. So
Yeah,
it's very different to what happened with the Clone Wars movie or the Attack of the Clones, when that was the first time they ever shot on digital, and it was also the first time the movie was almost completely shot on a green screen, blue screen. So they obviously, the prequels don't look as good as the original trilogy does because it was a brand new technology being tested for the first time. So it's very unique.
Yeah. Yeah, it is unique, and it kind of shows how he still has his vision. He was able to do more of it, but it is kind of odd to go back and look at how are these movies from 1999 to 2005 have some worse effects than these movies from the 70s. But we've got Grant in here. How you doing, Grant?
I'm doing well. How are you?
We're doing good. We've just been talking about the production quality so far of these movies, and we've just been chilling. What I was wanting to get into, yeah, we've been chilling. What I've been wanting to do is kind of talk about Maul and some of what Filoni mentioned, because Filoni, I think, is the perfect person to carry on Star Wars. And if you go back and watch some of what he's explained there's a specific video I'm thinking of where he's talking about Darth Maul and how Darth Maul is intentionally supposed to look like the most evil person you've ever seen.
Yeah,
like he's supposed to be the physical embodiment of evil.
Like almost demonic.
Continues. What were you gonna say, Grant?
I said like almost demonic.
Yeah, almost demonic. But then he continues to talk about Duel of the Fates, and of course that's an iconic song. But the reason it has its name, as Filoni talks about, is because that was the duel for Anakin's fate, mainly between Maul and Qui-Gon. Because how Anakin turns out is just the entire way Anakin's life goes changes based on the result of that fight. Because if Qui-Gon wins, Qui-Gon gets to train Anakin. He can be the father figure he never had, and he can help guide him and go, look, the Jedi Order is straying from its ways. Taylor and I were talking about that a little bit before. But the Order is, like the comparison Taylor used is like the Jedi Order were like the Pharisees, how they had lost track of their goal and their mission and had just strayed away from it, and evil had come back. And Qui-Gon recognized it, and Dooku recognized it. However, they took two different pathways to try and solve it. Yeah, Gabriel, there is a lot of beautiful symbolism in this film. And so he talks about how if Qui-Gon had won, he would have been able to train Anakin properly, and Anakin never would have turned to the dark side, and everything would have been different. But because Maul won the duel of the fate, or duel of the fates, Anakin turned out the way that he did, because although Obi-Wan was like a brother to him, he wasn't the father figure he needed.
Yeah, the father figure he needed was Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon would have essentially turned Anakin into a gray Jedi, because establishing that the Jedi of the time had lost their way, like I described before, like they had eventually become Pharisees who knew the religion, knew the backstory, knew everything, but had become almost so complacent and so arrogant in their comfort of nothing can go wrong because we're here. They literally let the dark side fester within 10 feet of them. That was insane.
It's really well done, religious, like a religious allegory. Like I've never viewed it that way, but like looking back at it, it works really well.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, you're right, Gabriel. And Taylor was talking about this a minute ago, where if you just look at these movies as a whole, like these three movies, it doesn't make sense that Anakin could be the chosen one. But when you look at it in the light of the 6 movies, we're just going to ignore 7, 8, and 9 right now. But if you look at it in the light of these 6 movies, Anakin ultimately does bring balance to the Force, even if it's not in the way the Jedi thought it would go.
Because their viewing of the balance was the Sith are exterminated completely, and in their eyes, the Sith had already been exterminated. So they were like, I don't see what the deal is, what the point is, but okay. And the idea was that Anakin needed to not only exterminate the Sith, exterminate the Emperor, but also exterminate the corruption of the Jedi itself. The Jedi were meant to be peacekeepers, but they had essentially lost their own view of how the universe was balanced and became like furthest from what they were supposed to be. And that's what Anakin got rid of. He destroyed that establishment that had created that type of Jedi. And then his son was supposed to renew the Jedi, or rather George Lucas's plans. His daughter was supposed to fix it.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Lucas had planned for Leia to be the one that fixed it.
Yeah, Leia was supposed to be the chosen one to unite the universe after Vader.
Interesting. I didn't know that either, but that's very interesting.
I would have loved to see that paid off.
Yeah. But no, like I said, I have a whole podcast about it. I go in detail.
Yeah. And Gabriel's kind of got them this is a perfect like encapsulation of it too, of they were so arrogant and full of themselves that they're like, do we really need someone to bring balance? Like,
yeah,
is the prophecy true? Does this have to happen?
Does it matter?
Yeah. Even someone as wise as Yoda and as powerful as Mace Windu were still falling into that trap.
Yeah, and Yoda was meant to be. Now we know that even in the retcon canon, with now the High Republic, that Yoda had been around from the literally 800 years training Jedi. So he had lived through the High Republic. He was part of the complacency. He realized he was part of the problem, which is why he went into exile. It's because he realized I had been gearing this whole generation toward this point, and it's my fault. And that's why he's like, all right, I'm going to go live in a swamp, and it's my fault. No more electricity for me.
Yeah. We want to talk about some of the problems that people have with it, because I feel like the most common problem I see people talk about is the dialogue. At least one of the most common is the dialogue. And if you can make an argument, the dialogue is not the best across all of the Star Wars movies.
I have always argued that George Lucas is a great writer, but not the best director. And in the original movies, the movies that paid off the best were the ones that he wrote, but he did not direct, because his dialogue was there, his ideas were there, but someone with a better eye of delivery and overall acting ability was there to make it like not that way, you know?
Yeah. You know, I could definitely see that. I don't think the dialogue is generally as bad as people say. I mean, part of it is Anakin is such a unique character. Like, I don't like, you can tell that he's not always right. And it's just his uniqueness and just how he is just so odd and strange that he doesn't make sense. Like, you just listen to him talk and he's just so emotional, and he's so like, everything's based off of his emotions that he does. He's impulsive. He sees something he wants, and he goes, I want this, I'm gonna go get it no matter the cost, basically.
Yeah.
And that can be good, but it's just sometimes that's just not the right thing. And I think that shows up in how he talks and the way that he is, and leads him down the path that he follows.
Yeah, and that was always the biggest thing, is they wanted to show that he was this kid who was gifted from the start. I mean, obviously, they kind of went a little overboard with showing how gifted he was. Like, the pod race scene would have been good enough, but also saving the entire Naboo kingdom with his wicked flying skills, that was a bit much. But I think people tend to overlook that he was supposed to be this child prodigy, and because of his own skills, he did become arrogant, because then he was raised to believe that he was the chosen one. Mm-hmm. So he's like, okay, well, maybe I'm the chosen one. Maybe I'm like the Messiah, essentially. And it went to his head, because he believed that no matter what he did, it was going to be fine, because he was the one to bring balance to the Force.
Yeah.
So it definitely backfired pretty hard.
Oh, yeah, it did. And that shows up too. He's sort of got that ego of, well, I am the chosen one, so why can't I do what I want? I'm the one that's going to save y'all anyways. And of course, that ultimately becomes his downfall and the Jedi's downfall, which the downfall they needed.
But even then, like you can kind of see the battle within Anakin throughout the trilogy, right? Every time he is told to wait, to be patient, he does come to his senses, right? I mean, he does turn Palpatine in. He does basically say, "This is wrong. I have to do this," and obviously Palpatine manipulated his fears. But if Mace Windu would have done what actual protocol was and followed the Jedi way and said, "No, let's arrest him," it would have prevented everything. So it's
even and even if Anakin had just and if Anakin had just let Windu kill him, even like Anakin wouldn't have turned, because before, like when he goes and tells him, Mace says, "If what you've told me is true, you've gained my trust."
Yeah.
Like everything was about to turn around for Anakin. He wouldn't have been upset at the council once they made him a master. All that would have went away. Then he didn't know it, but then he wouldn't have been the reason that Padme ends up dying.
Right.
It's like I was saying earlier, he is the downfall of everything that he loves, and his desire to try to make things right and having these dreams and going, I can fix it, I can do this, I can do that, I'm the chosen one. That's what causes those things to actually happen. 100%. And so there's kind of a tragedy to his character in a sense too, of he loved his mom and he wanted to save his mom and couldn't, that he took that anger out on the Tusken Raiders, and he was just wanting to save his wife who he loved, and in doing so got manipulated by Palpatine and got turned to the dark side. I think there's a genius there with Palpatine because of the way that he expertly manipulated Anakin is just perfect. Like he was subtle and just guided him till he gained his trust, and then sprung on him, "I'm the Sith Lord."
Yeah. And even then, like, you have all this stuff where you could see Palpatine trying to like get him little by little and just kind of pick at him. And then as soon as he reveals himself, Anakin's like, "Oh, hell no, you're the problem. I got to stop you." And like, and that was to show you that Anakin, like George Lucas said it himself, that Anakin's biggest tragedy is that he was a good person trapped in a terrible situation. And his whole situation only existed because he felt trapped. I mean, he became a Sith because he had no other options, right? He betrayed the Jedi Order in an instant, realized he made the mistake, and then was like, he was backed into a corner, and then Palpatine's like, "By the way, I can save your wife." He's like, "Fine, I'll do the bad stuff. I'll fall into the dark side. This is the only chance I have because now my choices have been taken from me by my own hand. I messed up so bad that there's no redeeming myself."
And then he has to fight with Obi-Wan on Mustafar, and then at that point he is burned to a crisp, and the only way he can stay alive is to cling to the dark side and use that as his will to live, kind of like Maul does after Episode 1, until he can get his legs.
The joke has always been that the good side, the light side, they tend to die because they're good, and the dark side tends to survive all these life-shattering, fatal injuries because they're just too angry to die. And like, you see that a lot in, like, even in the Obi-Wan show, the joke was that every character who gets this almost life-ending stab, from Reva to the Grand Inquisitor, like, they get the same injury, but the dark side is just too angry to die, so they keep going.
Yeah, I mean, Palpatine survived. Well, I've got that. Let me find that video real quick, because this is. Do I have that? Yep.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Bruh.
I love that line just because when people are like, "Oh my God, it's so bad writing," I'm like, but how would they know? Nobody knows how he's back, right?
Yeah.
And now, thanks to the shows like The Bad Batch, we know that not only was Palpatine scared for his life, that he was literally working from the time frame of like pre-Clone Wars to make sure that if he died, he wouldn't be gone for good. Like he was like, I'm going to get betrayed like Darth Plagueis, and if I do, I've got a contingency to prevent this from like being the final death. So
yeah,
I always found it kind of funny that people always dump on that line, but it's like, how would anyone, like, he just showed up one day, right? Like Palpatine's like, guess what, everybody, I'm alive, and everyone's like, oh my god, how? But like,
he's not going to tell you. It's not like if you go,
no one,
hey guys, I survived. I had this secret cloning facility, and I cloned like myself using Grogu's blood.
and for the better part of the last 20 years, I have been cloning and jumping
Yeah.
from body to body because the bodies can't sustain me. So yeah, there's not gonna be some press release where they explain how he came back. He's just gonna show up and be like, guess what? I'm here. And that was all it was gonna be. So I always thought the internet outcry over that scene was just nitpicking. Like, it's always just funny to me. It's like,
yeah, you know,
like, I'm sorry, he wouldn't put out a press release. He would just start declaring that he's back and start killing people. Like, that's what he did.
So he's got to make it. He got to make it a statement on his return and how he survived. It's like, no, he doesn't.
He'll be on 60 Minutes at the end of the week. He'll explain everything in a long conversation with Barbara Walters. It's going to be fantastic.
Yeah, of course. I want to talk a little bit about Revenge of the Sith because we talked about some specific like parts of it, but I think this movie has had a huge impact on our culture, especially recently with the internet. Like all the memes that came from it. There's a lot of stuff that has come from this movie that I know George Lucas couldn't have expected, but I think this movie has a lot of. It just had a huge cultural impact, probably like the best since the original trilogy.
Yeah.
It's kind of how our culture's evolved, but like all of the memes that have come from it, like as weird as it sounds, has almost made the movie better as time goes on because people see all this different stuff on there and they go, oh, I know this. Oh, I've seen that. And then it all starts to connect in their head.
Yeah. And then trying to watch the movies again and be like, oh, this is a meme. Oh, this is a meme. Oh, this is a meme. Mm-hmm. It's pretty great.
It is.
Always loved it. And meme culture has been one of the most unique and ridiculous sides of the Star Wars fan that could have ever existed.
Yeah.
Which to me is part of why I think that the fandom as a whole has now finally started to forgive the prequels, because if they're willing,
Sorry, my mom. What is she? My mom's talking to my dad. I think he ate something of hers, but
like the memes are kind of a testament that now that people can make fun of it, they're not as angry about it, and now it's becoming something that's cherished, which is really nice.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's come back and has kind of been changed is the view on like Hayden Christensen, and I would say in particular because he was almost like a singular focus of hate for a long time.
If you watch the prequels, you either hated Jar Jar Binks or you hated Hayden Christensen, and I always attribute that to be one of the most ridiculous things because, like, I remember when I was watching The Walking Dead on TV for the first time, and when they introduced the character of the governor. And the guy was on an interview, I think with like Conan O'Brien or something, and he said that people would see him on the streets and get mad at him for what he did to certain characters. And he was like, I'm just an actor. And that's kind of always treated like, if you hate the character, that means the actor did a good job. Like,
yeah, exactly.
That's the point.
Yeah, Hayden did such a great job of playing the unique, and Gabriel, who's been watching, put a comment up a little bit ago, how Anakin's such a different character that it's hard to relate to him.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the case, and I think that's part of it, but just the fact that people didn't like these movies and that they didn't like the character of Anakin in particular led to a lot of hate on Hayden. That is really just like, I don't get it, because looking back, you can go, Hayden did such a great job playing such a bad character. Yeah, that he should get credit for it.
Character. Like, he's supposed to be a character that is on the cusp of falling and becoming the greatest evil of all of cinematic history. and he's not going to be this character that you're going to be like. And I mean, mind you, you can also kind of argue that Hayden's like whole approach and whole like his whole characterization was greatly benefited by the Clone Wars TV show. If you watch the TV show now, and then you like the TV show definitely changed a lot for people, and I think that's something that I think probably why people are more forgiving about it is because you had so many seasons of this show that acted as beautiful and perfect backstory that not only did it rationale all of the, it filled all the gaps that George Lucas had put in there, and it also allowed people to be a lot more forgiving because when they saw the backstory of why Anakin became the way he did, you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'm just the asshole. Like maybe he's not bad. So I like to think that George Lucas's greatest thing that he did was commission the Clone Wars because it definitely turned a lot of people around from being what they were.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and Palpatine's just such a wonderful character because when you look back and you can see the whole series as a whole, you can see like he is the Phantom Menace in episode 1, and there's no way you would have known that.
No.
He's the guy in the background working all things to where it ends up leading in this trilogy. And even when you continue on in 4, 5, and 6, he's working from the shadows. He's working all these things, and it's just you go back and watch it, and you can just see how he manipulates every situation and go, "Wow, this guy's good." And I think that Ian McDermott was the perfect choice to play Palpatine too.
Yeah. My bad, I froze there. But I got to piggyback on what you were saying. George Lucas's foresight. I think a lot of people don't realize that George Lucas had planned to make the prequels on purpose. So that's why he cast a younger actor to play Palpatine in Return of the Jedi and then aged him hardcore with makeup so that he could use him at the age he wanted him to 10, 15 years later when he was making the prequels. Yep. So he, like, for people who said, oh, he never had a plan, he 100% had a plan. And that's why it was the way it was.
Yeah. And I mean, there's certainly aspects of the plan that changed because I think at first, I'm not sure he knew that Luke and Leia were going to be brother and sister.
Yeah, he did.
Like in the original.
He changed that as he was going. But when he did it with the other movies, like that was his, I think by the time he was finishing Empire Strikes Back, he's like, yeah, they're siblings. Like that was how he.
Yeah.
But there's also the behind the scenes stories that the whole line from Yoda saying, nope, there is another, wasn't supposed to be referencing Leia, but that's what he did end up going back to.
Do you know who it was originally supposed to be referencing?
Not a clue. I think
there's part of me that's wondered, and I don't know how if he would have had thought this out, but part of me's always wondered, could that have been Ahsoka?
Ahsoka was created years later when he brought Dave Filoni in, so that was much later on in the whole timeline of things.
Okay. I will say one thing that this trilogy does well, just across the entire trilogy, is the lightsaber battles.
Yeah.
I mean the Anakin and Obi-Wan duel on Mustafar is iconic, and if I'm not mistaken, there was a different duel that they had actually like choreographed that was even better originally that they didn't end up using.
There was multiple. Almost every duel in Episode 3 had different takes. Like the other duel that they had with Palpatine versus the Jedis was very different and very, very much more brutal and just insane. And then they went with the one that they did because they needed to save time. Same thing with the Anakin Obi-Wan fight. They choreographed a much darker and more violent fight, and they had to go with that one because, like, well, we could either do this scene and it can push us like an extra hour, or so like they definitely had to compromise, but there was a lot more that they had planned.
But even in those compromises, they're still iconic dueling scenes, and they're the best dueling scenes we've had in Star Wars. I mean, the Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan versus Maul ones, the Anakin and Obi-Wan one, even like the Palpatine and Yoda one. Those are really cool.
They're really good. And I think that was for a lot of people the reason why the sequels didn't live up and why people are now becoming more forgiving of the prequels is because the lightsaber battles in the prequels were perfect. And they just never did it. Like they never got to that level again.
Yeah, they definitely didn't. And one thing I was going to mention, I mentioned this in last week's episode, was Grant didn't know the story of how Ray Park ended up becoming Maul. If I'm not mistaken, Ray Park was like the stunt double for the character. And then the original actor, I think after realizing how few lines he had, was just like, I don't want to do this anymore.
That's fully possible, like, to be honest.
I know for sure he was the body double, and then the original actor left. And then they're like, well, you're the body double. You've only got a couple lines. You already know the choreography. Do you want to do this?
Well, they still used a different actor for the dialogue. Like the Ray Park actually never spoke as Maul. Yeah. Like in general, even when they brought him back for Solo, it was Sam Witwer in Solo, which I thought was pretty cool because Sam Witwer redefined Darth Maul for an entire audience, and then he got to be the live action voice for him too, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, Sam Witwer is awesome. He was also Maul in Rebels, and I think he even did Palpatine in one of the games.
He's done Palpatine a lot, actually. So,
he's the man.
He played Palpatine more than Ian McDiarmid played Palpatine. So
was he the voice in the Clone Wars for Palpatine?
I believe so. Yeah.
It does. Sam Witwer is the man. You're never going to beat his Kenobi scream in Rebels.
Right. I honestly, George Lucas was so smart to commission the Clone Wars show and to basically redefine so many characters. And I think Maul was the greatest example of how to take a very one-dimensional character and probably turn him into one of the best characters of the franchise.
Absolutely, yeah. It adds another depth to this character because you get to know him better, because all you have of Maul in the movies is you just have the Maul that is just this evil looking guy. You really don't know much about him. You just know he's bad. He's got a cool lightsaber, and he supposedly dies. But then you get the added depth and just see him evolve as a character. I think the Clone Wars in general, like Ahsoka, is a fantastic example of how to develop a character.
And I think a lot of people kind of just sleep on it because, like, when I saw Solo, and then the big ending twist with Maul showing up at the end of Solo, a lot of people were like, "What?" And then even my dad, for instance, I showed him the movie, and he's like, "Oh, that was cool." And then Maul showed up. He's like, "When does this movie take place?" I'm like, after the Emperor. He's like, "How is Maul still alive?" And I'm like, "There is 6 or 7 seasons of a show I have to introduce you to." And he's like, "I'm not ready for that kind of a commitment right now." And then the same thing happened again when we were watching The Mandalorian. And then he's like, "Who's this Jedi girl?" I'm like, "That's Anakin's apprentice." And he's like, "Anakin had an apprentice?" And I was like, "That TV show, come on." So
but Ahsoka is another example of like the difference between Ahsoka and Rey. And Grant and I are definitely going to get into this more when we talk about the sequel trilogy. But just for a brief like explanation of why Star Wars fans love Ahsoka and hate Rey is because of character development.
Yeah, 100%.
Because Ahsoka in the first couple episodes is kind of annoying, but she ends up developing into this really likable character who is able to connect and bring out a side of Anakin you don't always see.
And that's why I always will say, like, you got to trust Dave Filoni, because when people were like, with the latest season of The Mandalorian, when people were like, "Oh, I don't know if I like this was kind of blah," and I was like, guys, let them tell the story they're telling, because this is Dave Filoni, the guy who brought one of the most annoying characters to life, and then now that character has her own show, and people are more excited about that show than they were even Obi-Wan's show. Like, that should tell you how good of a character this is. And if you just let the guy tell his story, it's going to work.
Absolutely. I still need to watch this season of The Mandalorian. I haven't seen it yet.
I liked it a lot.
I need to see it.
People need to like stop dumping on it because yes, there was a lot of filler and waste, but 99% of that filler and waste is going to come into play later. So
yeah,
let them cook.
yeah, and I've always been one. I don't mind slow episodes because or even if it's a couple in a season that are building somewhere, but you can't see it yet, because you have to have those. Like there has to be slower times where you set up these things that are going to come back later, and you can see the payoff.
Yeah, and there's 100%. That's what this is. I'm reading the comment that's popped up. Yeah.
Throw it up.
I think that what he is doing is not fixing the Disney trilogy. I think he's doing exactly what he did on the Clone Wars, where when he came in to work on the Clone Wars, it was after episode 3, and they were basically like, hey, we have this mountain of backstory that needs to be told.
Mm-hmm.
So let's tell it in a way that makes those movies make more sense, make them better. Because on face value, if you watched episodes 1, 2, and 3 in theaters, they were okay. They were good.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you watch them now, after all the Clone Wars shows, all the other stuff, they're a lot better. And I'm not like a sequel apologist. I liked them a lot, but they're still the in the ranking of the 3 trilogies, still at the bottom of the rank for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm not some sequel hater. And I think that if Disney is hiring someone like Dave Filoni to make the sequels better by giving a necessary backstory that we should have had from the beginning, I'm all for it. And I also quietly believe that Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau are doing exactly what George Lucas wanted to do with his sequel trilogy in his projects, because all the stories that they're telling are essentially the same stories that George wanted to tell. So I'm kind of loving the idea that they're not only bridging the 2 trilogies together, but they're also giving us a lot of what George wanted to give us to begin with.
Yeah, and I think they're doing a good job, because I haven't seen this season, but there's so many things in the sequel trilogy. It's like the prequels when they came out, where there's so many things that are almost jarring, where you're like, why is Luke like this? This is not what I pictured Luke being like in 20, 30, 40 years. I can't remember the exact time jump between them. I think it's more like 20 something.
Something like that, yeah. But then
it's like, that's not how we pictured Luke. Han and Leia aren't together anymore. Kylo's a bad guy. How did we get here? And you get little bits of information, but how do we get here? And so when it's not what people expect, they don't like it. And I'm not a huge fan of the sequel trilogy, but I like that they're going in and filling in this information in this huge time jump where you go, okay, I can see how these characters got here.
Yeah. And I think that's what's important too, because I will still say that one of the greatest scenes of all Star Wars TV had to be that season 2 finale of The Mandalorian, where Luke shows up and you see Luke in his prime. And then I can defend. I mean, I loved the Book of Boba Fett as a show. There were some major flaws to it, yes, but that Luke episode showed what everyone wanted Luke to be in episode 8. So, yes, I mean, I still hope that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni have more Luke and Leia and Han Solo plans going forward, because I'm sure they do. And if that means that the movie that they're setting up is going to feature those 3 characters in massive roles, I'm all for it.
Absolutely, yeah. And it'll be interesting to see, and Grant and I'll talk more about this. I can't remember if it's next week, the week after, we're doing the sequel trilogy, but the new movie they have planned with Daisy Ridley coming back as Rey, there's some reports that John Boyega might come back as Finn. I don't know if those are confirmed or not.
Not confirmed yet, but there are definitely the reports are there, and people are thinking that. The thing is, the most recent bit of information that came out was that Daisy was not going to be the main character of this new movie. And now people are hoping that it's Finn, because if Finn is going to become the Jedi that he's supposed to, it would be really cool to have him as the main character. But it's probably not going to be, because I know how Disney does things, so it's probably not going to be what we want, but it's going to be something.
But it'll be interesting because they've got the chance at redemption because they're bringing Daisy Ridley back. If John Boyega is back, I would assume that there's something in there that makes him feel like the character of Finn is being redeemed.
Yeah, because he was
very vocal.
Very vocal about his displeasure with how they treated his character.
Yeah. And I would say that's fair displeasure because of how he was set up at the end of 7 and what ended up happening.
Yeah.
I would assume if he comes back, it would have to be because they're doing something with the character that he is happy with and trying to redeem him.
Right.
So I think that movie's going to be interesting because, yeah, he said the new character is going to be some new Jedi in training. Could be Finn, could be someone else.
I think even if it's not Finn, if Finn just walks out in like a Jedi robe, I'll be like, there it is.
Yes.
Shut up and take my money.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, with how we're setting up, could Grogu be in this movie in some capacity?
It's fully possible. I mean, if he may be talking by that point. He should be talking by that point. It's like 35 years later, so he should be fully conversing.
Yeah.
And ironically, I think one of the funniest things about Star Wars lore as a whole is that Yoda only talks the way he talks because he is respecting the master who taught him how to be a Jedi. So Yoda's backward speak is not exclusive to his species. So Grogu's going to talk completely normal. Yaddle talk completely normal. I mean, if you watch Tales of the Jedi on Disney Plus, Yaddle's episode, you're like, oh my gosh, they don't all talk like this. But it was because they explained it. Like, and even then, like George Lucas even pushed it really hard in the prequels because for the first time you see Yoda speak an episode in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, he doesn't speak like he did in the prequels. He speaks fairly normal with only the last sentence of his paragraph being backwards. And then in the prequels, it was all backwards. So I think in my headcanon is that Yoda just got like, he just got tired. He just got tired of it. Like 30 years later, he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna start talking normally because it's confusing people.
Yeah. That's interesting. Actually, I haven't seen Tales of the Jedi. I've seen a couple of the episodes, but I didn't realize that
it's worth sitting down and watching because you can watch the whole thing in about 45 minutes. Like it's very quick. But the Darth Tyrannus stuff, Count Dooku stuff, his backstory completely redefines how you see the character in episode 2 because it explains that Dooku fell literally on the day of Qui-Gon's death. That's when he fell because he didn't want to go to the funeral. He didn't want to be there. He blamed himself for not being there. And then he was manipulated on the day of the funeral.
Dooku's almost got that same sort of arc that Anakin has in the sense of he was manipulated and ultimately betrayed by Palpatine.
Which is Palpatine's thing. Like Palpatine just likes messing with people in times of crisis. That's what he does.
Yeah. It shows his brilliance as a character. I've got to throw this up on the screen because that is great.
No, to agree with Psy98, The Last Jedi was a very rocky experience for a lot of people, but the scene with Yoda was probably one of the greatest scenes of the sequel trilogy as a whole. Because everything that he said, every lesson that he learned, it was exactly what the right mentality that those movies had to have. And it was truly probably the best of Yoda in those moments where he's basically describing what it was, describing like the books don't matter, the lessons don't matter. Like he was basically like I said, he had acknowledged that the Jedi had become the problem and the dogma of the Jedi contributed to it. And the Force isn't beholden to the Jedi or the Sith. The Force is everything. So Yoda acknowledging that and rising above it was probably one of the greatest scenes of Star Wars.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. And it's like, that's not what you would have expected from Yoda, but at the same time, it's also kind of what you might expect.
Right. Especially when he struck the lightning into like that was pure Yoda. I was like, there it is.
Yeah.
Like,
But then
we got
there was
the Muppet back.
even yeah, but then there was even like Luke where he threw the lightsaber over the cliff and then tells Rey that's not how you treat the weapon of a Jedi.
Yeah.
And that's kind of more of the Luke that people expected. But that's
Because I
kind
think,
of after he breaks out
and
of
a
his
lot of
shell.
people were like, "Oh, that's just a retcon. They're trying to fix that." But at the same time, that's kind of part of the character, right? I mean, I know you guys are going to discuss it next week, and I'm just going to kind of go into it because I'm probably not going to be here next week with you guys. But Luke's journey in that movie made complete sense. He was fallen, he was broken, he did exactly what Yoda and Obi-Wan had done, thinking that he just needed to seclude himself, and then he decided to get back into the fight, redeemed himself, and that's why when you see him in Rise of Skywalker, he's the way he is, because he's like, I messed up, and then I redeemed myself, and now this is post-redemption Luke, and that's why it made more sense.
Absolutely, yeah. And like we were talking about with what Favreau and Filoni are doing with these series, I can't wait to see they're gonna. I can't wait for them to show what ends up happening just in like full with his temple, how it's going, and then how it falls, and so like just the immediate aftermath. Because we have the little picture of it, but we don't have the full picture of how it got to that point.
Right.
Because at least the last time I saw Luke, it was still the Luke that everyone had expected to see. And so how exactly does stuff go wrong to get to the point that it does? And so I think that's part of it's part of what's good at what they're doing with these shows is they're filling in this huge time gap and filling in these discrepancies of what people expected versus what we got. And I think eventually we'll look back at the sequel trilogy and go, this makes a lot more sense, and we actually like this story once you have the information filled in.
Yeah.
Somewhat, at least.
I would very much like to see just a scene where like Luke is at the temple training and he's got his class, and then you have Han and Leia show up with their like 6-year-old. Here's our son Ben, ready to learn from his uncle, and that's kind of where they just leave it, you know, because you know that he's probably trained with him for like 10 years or so. So it would kind of make sense to be nice, and then you're like, oh, the next time we see you, you're a bad guy. But
yeah,
Star Wars is full of tragedy, and that's the point of Star Wars.
It is, yeah. And even Ben, who ultimately gets redeemed, his story is full of tragedy too, and some of that tragedy ultimately comes back to help redeem him, redeem him as a character. And I like that. We'll get into that more, but we've been going for 50 minutes here. I think we're about time to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely took some tangents, but my stance has always been the same. The Star Wars prequel trilogy is way better than people give it credit to, and the fact that it was one coherent story that you have to watch all three to see makes it even better. I mean, he planned all three from the start, so you got to watch all three. If you have issues with the first one, just keep watching because it'll fix itself as it goes on, because that was the point of the story.
Yeah, for sure. So to get into our normal criteria that we use, first of all, do you think that this movie succeeded in what it set out to do, or these movies in this case?
Yes, 100%. Because
I absolutely agree.
In hindsight, in retrospect, the Star Wars prequel trilogy redefined and reignited the fandom in a way that was not even expected the first time around. Because when the first trilogy came out, it was huge, it was exciting, and then the second trilogy came out, and it was like the kids who saw the first trilogy are now the parents of the kids who are watching the second trilogy, and it reunited Star Wars and a love of Star Wars in a completely different way. But the fact that this whole trilogy was full of this deep political intrigue that most people don't even catch unless they watch it a second time. Yes, 100%. It turned out exactly what George wanted to do, and it's way better than people give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. Our next criteria, and we talked about it, is it overrated? Is it underrated? Is it properly rated? I think we both agree it's absolutely underrated.
I think so, yeah. I mean,
are they the best movies? No, but
no.
They're drastically underrated.
Yeah, they probably have the best fight scenes of the franchise. Certainly the best music of the franchise.
Absolutely.
But yes, I think people tend to focus on Jar Jar boing, So let's dump on these movies, but they're severely underrated.
Absolutely. And then our final criteria, because we don't like to do letter grades, is does the movie pass or does it fail?
It's a pass, 100%.
Yeah. Absolutely. We used to
I
do
would even
letter
argue
grades on our old
passes,
show.
but barely. Yeah.
Yeah. We did letter grades on our old show, and then I got in trouble even with my mom for giving Tombstone a C+.
Oh, you'd be in trouble with me for giving Tombstone a C+. Tombstone is one of the best westerns of all time.
Yeah,
Huck Kilmer
he
and
once,
I'll Be Your Huckleberry. His Doc Holliday is iconic.
Yeah, Grant wants
You
to
better
review
educate
that
yourself.
to give me a chance to redeem myself. Yeah. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Taylor. Next week, I just checked our schedule. We are doing the sequel trilogy next week. We've discussed that in parts in this episode, in our episode last week, but next week is where we'll dive on into it. Grant's got some hot takes. I know one of his hot takes is, as a pure movie, The Last Jedi is the best Star Wars movie. And that's a take he's held for a couple of years now. Can't say I agree with it.
I missed the hot take. What was his hot take?
His hot take is that The Last Jedi is the best pure movie of any Star Wars movie.
I could argue as that. Yeah, probably. I mean, I have a handful of issues with the movie that would have kept it from being perfect, but on its own, it's pretty solid.
Okay.
Yeah, it's got some amazing moments, but it does
Yeah.
also piss a lot of people off, and I think that's probably why people dump on it so much.
Yeah, and we've got an episode on our old show where one of our viewers came in and roasted Grant about it and about the sequel trilogy, and that was hilarious. But next week we've got the sequel trilogy. Then the week after that we have just all the extra movies. So like Rogue One,
the spinoffs,
the spinoffs. Yeah, Rogue One I'm excited to talk about because that's one of the best Star Wars movies too.
Yeah, my top 3 Star Wars movies are Rogue One, Empire Strikes Back, and Revenge of the Sith. Like, Rogue One is so good. It has no right to be as good as it is, and it's only being amplified by how good Andor is and how good Andor season 2 is probably going to be.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you all for joining. So if you'd like to support us, if you'd like to support just the Culture Nerd in general, you can go to patreon.com/theculturenerd there. There's a specific tier for Through the Monocle, or there's just the general Culture Nerd Patreon. This little slide's a little wrong because I've been your host today, Grant Skillen. Thank you, Taylor, for joining me. Thank you to each of our Patreon supporters. Thank you to Jose for the logo and Taylor for the intro.
You're welcome. You're welcome for that cool intro.
Yeah. Once again, thank you for joining us. Here we've got the QR code for our show, and then the other QR code is for the other podcast that Grant and I do called Much Talk About Nothing. We cover a variety of stuff on there. If you like it, if you like this episode, please go check it out. Anyways, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next week.